And the reason why it was held in that place is because the Norwegian government years ago decided to erect in this area, a memorial to the many people, mostly women, who in the 17th century, actually, I think the figure that has been given is 91 people were executed, mostly burned alive, under the charge of witchcraft. And as I said before, there's no question that witch hunting, a persecution that has involved men as well, but by 89%, it has really been targeting women. Witch hunting is really the most egregious, intense example of feminicide. So this is what I'm going to speak today, in broad outline, and then we can go more in depth in the question period. I have to say that the issue of witch hunting, entered my life as the life of many women feminists of my generation, in the 1970s, when in the process of really interrogating the past, going back to the past to rewrite women's history, a history that we realized had always been told by men. So in the process of doing that, we discovered the so-called great witch hunts of the 16th, 17th century in Europe, and then beyond Europe, because as I'm going to show, witch hunting was very, very soon, brought into the areas, the countries that the European conquered and colonized. So like for us was an incredible discovery because witch hunting is one persecution that has never been recognized publicly, has never been talked about, has been studied only by a very, very limited number of scholars in Europe. Never it has been taught, in the schools. The most conservative figure is that in the course of 2.5 centuries, more than 100,000 women were executed. Most of them after long periods of torture and in the most brutal way. Burning alive has been the method generally used. And we don't calculate in the number those who died, in jail, those who died even after they were released from jail, and all those that were forced out of their villages, who went into hiding and whose lives were destroyed by the accusation about the tortures. So we are speaking a very important, massive social phenomenon. And I will see also how it impacted the colonial world and the process of colonization. And as we know, and I'm now anticipating, my talk, it's not over, because in the 80s and 90s, we have seen a return of witch hunting in many parts of the world. Nevertheless, there's been like a curtain of silence drawn into this persecution. Not only that, but the figure of the witch, has been ridiculed, and, the witch has become, for example, in the United States, at the end of October, we have on All Saints' Day, the Day of the Dead, we have this practice where little children, girls in particular, go around, saying trick or treat, basically dressing up like witches, with a big hat, and asking for some gifts, some cookies, and so on. And they say trick or treat, like either you treat me, you give me something, or I will do something bad to you. So all is being turned into a sort of the witch, for most people, is a creature that belongs to a fantasy land. You know, it's been the women's movement, the work the feminist historians have done, who have in fact raised the consciousness, raised massively the consciousness, especially among women. The witches were not figures of legend, but they were real women, real people like you and me, who were accused of being of the most incredible crimes, right? Basically, of having made, for the sake of money and power, for the sake of money of power, having made a pact with the devil, and you know, and the pact was in exchange for money and power. They would basically commit the most outrageous crimes at the expense, kill people, kill children, raise hurricanes, raise the waves of the sea and drown the boats, and against their neighbor, against their communities. I saw incredible. And then there is a misconception, no? So we now understand that these were actually real events. These were actually real women, and this was a bloody persecution. And in Europe, it took place, roughly speaking, between 550 and 1700. 550 and 1700. And it took place, and this is very interesting, specifically in countries in which at the same time, you know, you had a development, you know, of a new kind of economy, of a new kind of social relation, which we now see as a capitalist economy. So the witch hunt belongs not to the medieval period. It begins at the end of the medieval period. It begins at the time when the medieval economy, medieval society, the medieval world, no, feudalism in Europe is actually entering into a crisis, And it comes into existence in the period of transition, what some call the transition to capitalism. This, in fact, is what I've been writing. You know, when I began this work, right? When I began this work, it was at first very baffling, right? Very difficult to understand, because when you see that for years and years, in many different countries, Catholic and Protestant, right? You have all these women, usually poor women, often peasant women, you know, accused of having made a pact with the devil, accused of flying in the night, in the sky, to these big meetings far away, where hundreds of thousands of women would meet, and then they would have meetings with the devil, etc. When you would hear, you know, the accusation, so fantastic, you know, immediately it becomes very difficult to place yourself in the position of the historian. You feel like you have entered, you know, a manicomium, a mental house, right? And so it was a kind of laborious process for myself, and I imagine for other feminist historians, to understand, well, why? To make sense of this wild accusation. And then one way that we began to do that was to see what was going on in this period. What was going on, you know, in the period in which the witch hunts began and climbed, you know? And how does it relate what stood behind the accusation and what was the purpose, what it accomplished. So first of all, it became very clear that the witch hunt were not inspired from below. They didn't come from the populace. They were not a product of old delusion, superstition, but instead the witch hunt was started out of decisions that were made by government. They were made by the institution. Laws were passed. In England, a whole set of laws were passed, criminalizing witchcraft and saying that there is a new crime. There is a new crime, the crime of witchcraft. And this is what women do. This is what people do when they are witches. And this is how you are forced to denounce it. If any of your neighbor, of the people that you know, are committing this crime. So it was the institution, it was from above that people were told. In the book that I've written, Caliban and the Witch, I've made the comparison with the question of terrorism. First is the government to say, well, there is this crime. And then, of course, over the period of time, people begin to, believe, accept these images, these accusation, right? And they begin, for example, to look at their neighbor, and if they see something that is not what they consider normal, they might say, she's a terrorist, she's a witch, right? So this was the first thing, right? That the witch hunts were not, something coming from below, but actually came from above. They were part of an institutional, governmental decision-making process. Also, secondly, that contrary to popular belief, the witch hunt were not a primarily religious phenomenon. So the church, the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, but before and after the split, right, the split into Catholic and Protestant, was very much involved in creating the image of the witch, right? In creating, the witch makes the pact with the devil. The witch is the enemy of God. But the persecution, particularly in the moments when it was most intense, the persecution was carried out by the lay authorities. It was carried out by the governments, local government, national governments. So it was not a primarily. And the proof is that we have persecution with very similar accusation, both in Catholic as well as in Protestant countries. So another strategy that I used was to begin to see what else was happening to women in this period. What other accusations were made against them? So the conclusion that I've drawn is that, first of all, witch hunting should be considered, one of the phenomena connected with the transformation of the social, political economy of Europe, from feudalism to capitalism. And that the key factor, the key elements to understand, why this sudden attack on women, this war on women, is to see that, all the major conditions in the transition to capitalism, all the major conditions of the organization of reproduction were changed. It was like a kind of, I just say, revolution or counter-revolution. Major transformation of the major condition of social reproduction. Land, major changes in land tenure. In the feudal economy, the peasantry, had access to land. The land was given by the lords, and the peasants owed to the lord labor services. But then in exchange for the labor services, they had some land which they can cultivate for their subsistence. And in addition to the land, they had users' rights of the commons. Commons were forests, lakes, forests to pick up wood, lakes to fish, right? Grazing ground for animals where you can have grass to graze and to have animals. So this was very, very basic. The majority of workers were peasants, farmers, cottagers. With the transition to capitalism, this comes to an end. The land is privatized, very violent process. Hundreds and hundreds of villages destroyed. People pushed off the common lands. There was a technical term that came into existence that was used, enclosure. Enclosure is when you put the fences around the fields to prevent people from going in. Enclosure, you close in. You close in the fields and you push out the people. This is happening today everywhere, by the way. They don't put the fences. They put people with rifles. But this is happening every day. So transformation in the relation to land. This creates massive impoverishment. Massive impoverishment. This creates hunger, malnutrition, vagrancy, the phenomenon of the vagabonds. Lots of people trying to leave their villages, begging, the process of begging, and the disintegration of communal relations. The world of the Middle Ages was a very communal world. Everything was done collectively. People made decisions about the land, harvesting, sowing collectively. All of that disintegrates. There's a new class that comes into existence of people who are enclosing the land and marketing the land. The land is bought and sold. The land is used for agriculture, for food products that are now bought and sold. So the whole marketing economy. Remember, this is a period in which simultaneously to the changes that are taking place in the land, you also have the colonization and conquest of parts of what we call now Latin America, and including the great silver mines, the great silver mine of the Andes, what we call Peru, and all this silver that comes into Europe goes to create a monetary economy, and more money circulates, the more land is privatized, the more the subsistence economy that existed in the feudal world is destroyed, right? So all of this very, very important and had clearly a big impact on women, impact on everybody, but particularly on women and on peasant women and particularly on older women, right? So one classical example of the witch, one classical example is the peasant woman, old peasant woman. She lives alone. She has nothing. She has nothing. She has to beg. She goes around begging to the richer people. She asks for some bread, wine, salt. They say no, and she curses them. She curses them. And then when somebody becomes sick, they say, she's a witch, right? She is a witch, right? At the same time, other phenomena were developing, because together with the transformation that were taking place in the land, in the relationship and the work that was done on the land, this is the period of the rise of wage labor, You also have the rise of new forms of work, new forms of industry, manufacture, the beginning of manufacture, right? And a new conception of work and discipline, right? So, for example, we go from a type of work week, where artisan work was connected with farming. You farmed and then you did a little bit of artisanal work, etc., to instead a specialization, to instead a work day or work week in which all day you manufacture things, mostly textile, cloth, etc., right? And there is a new conception, of work. There is a new discipline of work. And this brings about also new forms of social control, right? New forms of social control. So we see, for example, in this period, right, there is a whole transformation. There is a whole transformation, and on the side of governments, local and national, about, social discipline, about the organization of everyday life. We see, for instance, a big attack on all kinds of collective activity, sports, festivals, dances, even pilgrimages. Of course, there is a great fear on the side of the authorities of social protest, because the expropriation of the land, generates a lot of social protest, revolts, in which women were very important, in which women were very much participant. So there is a fear of revolts, and there is new forms of social control. But at the same time, there is also new forms of discipline that have to do with the idea of work, productivity, how life every day has to be regulated in order for the workers to be more disciplined, more productive, right? So, for example, here, the regulation of sexuality, the regulation of family life, right? Sexuality has to be controlled. It has to be constrained. It has to be directed to productive goals, It cannot be allowed to flourish spontaneously, because it undermines the discipline of work, the regularity of everyday life. And what we see in this period, it's also the beginning of a new sexual division of labor. A new sexual division of labor that begins to separate production and reproduction, right? So that reproductive activity, taking care of children, what we call housework, etc., begin to fall out of the world they consider, the economy. So only activities that are actually producing products for the market, only activity that produce products for the market are considered real work. This is true today too. And they are waged, and they're entitled, the worker, to some form of subsistence. Very little. In the 16th, 17th century, it was very, very little. So much so that so many people believed the wage work was slavery. They said there is no difference with slavery. So we find also now that as the 16th and 17th century proceeded, there is an exclusion of women. There is a particular form of impoverishment, immiseration that takes place among women, at least among the majority, those who did not have independent wealth, those who did not belong to the ruling classes. But we see a massive impoverishment because you have the double problem of the loss of land and no access to the new forms of wage work. Loss of land and no access. So this is the picture. This is the context in which I had to basically place what was taking place and make the connection between this development, this massive social transformation, social dislocation that affected thousands and thousands of people and created the modern capitalist economy, with the story, with the new legislation, the new persecution, and the story of the many women. So connecting the witch, well, the witch is the beggar, is the woman who is begging. And when she curses, she's accused. But the witch is also the prostitute, or the woman who's basically having children out of wedlock, or the woman who is having sexual relation with men from the higher classes or from people who belong to, outside of her circle. So she is the loose woman, right? And the witch is also the healer. In the feudal world, in the Middle Ages, in the peasant communities, you didn't have the doctor. The doctor is a creation of a later period. Is a creation of the 16th and 17th century. Before, you have the healer, what in Spanish they call la curandera. The healer is a woman who knows about herbs. She may have a little garden. She cultivates some herbs and maybe also some magical words. She mixes real remedies with perhaps magical chanting. And everybody went to the healer for people and for animals. And also you had the midwife, right? Usually it was always women who helped other women to give birth. You didn't have a doctor. Actually, until the 16th century in Europe, it was forbidden for men to enter the room where women were giving birth. It was forbidden. It was always women. If you look at the pictures, of that period that describe the birth giving, is always women. There's always a community of women around the woman who gives birth. You never see men. Right? So in this period, you have a whole set of new regulation, for instance, that forbid women from using contraceptives, that control the process of procreation. And you have the institution, of a college of doctors. To practice medicine, you have to have a license by the state, right? So when you develop this context, you understand, why women who were prostitutes, who were healers, who were midwives, and so on, are among the majority, of those accused of being witches. Although after a certain times, right, charging a woman with being a witch, was also a way of attacking her, in any kind of conflict. She rejected you sexually, we say she's a witch, right? And so briefly, because there's a lot more to say, briefly, but imagine the consequences on women's psyche and the social psyche, of seeing continuously, women accused, of having made a pact with the devil, and then brought to the square of the village or the square of the town, tied up, things put in their mouth so that they could not scream, stripped naked and burnt alive. And people had to witness because it was supposed to be educational, including the children of the witches, right? And as I said before, this persecution is brought in the same years into the colonies, what we call Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, areas that where a war, was begun against the indigenous population. And part of this war, the witch hunt becomes a tool in the process of colonization, because the missionaries begin to say, oh, they look at the religion of the indigenous population of the America, of the indigenous population of the Caribbean island, and they say, these are all devils. The idea, the concept of the red devil, right? Their religion are devilish. And the witch hunts are also used in the American plantation. This is the period of slavery. It's the period of the slave trade. And so the witch accusation are brought into the, used in many cases against slave revolts, or particularly slave leaders in revolts in the American and Caribbean plantation. So we are talking about a process that is really global, that within half a century had a global dimension. And in time, in fact, the question of witch hunting was brought by European missionaries in every country that they colonized, right? And there is no question in my mind that the witch hunts in Europe left very, very profound scars and had a very profound effect on the condition, the social position of women. The women who enter capitalist society with less social power than they had, for example, in many cases in the feudal world. There is a process of radical devaluation of women as social subject, a radical devaluation of women of their labor. And not accidentally, if you look at the codes, the legal codes and constitution of Europe in the 17th and 18th century. One example is the Napoleonic Code after the French Revolution. Women were non-person. Women were non-person legally. In England, you have the phenomenon of the femme couverte, the covered woman. The covered woman is the woman who does not have a legal persona. If she has a legal problem, she is covered by the husband. It's the husband that represents her, or the father, or the brother, or represents her in court. She does not have she's not a legal persona. It took a long, long, long time for women to be considered full social subjects, So there is no question that the witch hunt has had a very, very profound impact. So when we studied, again, it's no accident then when many of us, myself included, began to read, began to discover, began to investigate, it had a profound impact on us. I don't think that anything that I've studied, except the slave trade and colonization, yes, this has been the same emotional impact, the same emotional, or perhaps reading about the imposition of the death penalty to this day in many countries. but it has had a profound psychological impact. You know, in a way, the writing about the witch hunts has become one of the projects of my life, because I've seen that how significant it is, you know, that when a society wages a kind of war against the social subject who in fact are most connected and most directly responsible for the reproduction of everyday life, and begins to suspect of their existence and portray their existence as being completely evil. No? So I've seen that this has been a major attack on women. And when I was writing in the 90s and 2000, I had no idea that very soon I would actually find the same processes taking place in my own time. Because starting in the 80s and 90s, you know, step by step, hand in hand, with the expansion of capitalist relations throughout the world, in Africa, India, the parts of Asia, we see, you know, the return of witch hunting. You know, and as of today, you know, the figures are very difficult because the area is so vast, right? But for Africa, for Africa, there are figures that speak about 20,000, 30,000 women killed, many other pushed out of their villages, many other, you know, tortured and basically maimed for life. To give an idea, you know, there are now witches camps in the northern part of Ghana, you know, to which women flee because they are chased out of their villages, or because they are afraid of being persecuted, right? There have been witch hunts and attacks on women in the Congo, Nigeria, Angola, Tanzania, Kenya, many parts of India, particularly in India against Dalit women, indigenous women, right? Or low-class women, what they call low-class women. And Papua New Guinea. And from the work that I've done on the 16th and 17th century has been very helpful, because it has helped me understand that once again, also in our time, you know, the new witch hunt, behind these new witch hunts, you really have a process of expansion of capitalist relations. And then we find, you know, in new ways, some of the same developments that you had in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, or that you had, you know, in parts of Latin America that were colonized. And for example, one of the things, just to take Africa, one of the things that has been happening is that more and more, you know, until the 1980s, you know, the agricultural work was the main form of sustenance, the main form of support for the majority of people, right? But then what we begin to see, particularly as a consequence of the so-called debt crisis, which was totally engineered, and the process of the IMF, International Monetary Fund Structural Adjustment Program, you know, which introduced all these reforms. They were supposed to be for economic recovery and making the countries pay their debts. Because of that, you know, these countries had to open the doors to all kinds of imports and to all kinds of extractivist companies, companies that took over the land for nothing, mining, petroleum, agribusiness, companies that are growing green gasoline, you know, grasses, elephant grasses that are used to produce green gasoline. So what is happening is a situation where one of the main sources of support, the land, and when we say land, we say more than land. We say forests, trees, water, lakes, coastal areas. Land is never just land. Land is a whole commonwealth, a whole wealth of nature that has been fundamental for people's survival for centuries. So when all of that is privatized, when all of that is basically put on monetary and market relation, and when the land becomes scarce, people are losing it, government are claiming it, right? What you have is an intensification of local conflicts, an intensification of local conflicts, where people, in a way, in a sense, begin to, enter into war with each other, sometimes even in the same family, and mostly in the different generation. Younger people look at the elderly or elderly women who have some land, why they should have some land when we were young, etc. We who can use it, right, don't have it, right? So, for example, to make things short, one of the factors behind the accusation and the killing of a woman as a witch in Africa, in India, is to take the land that she has. Land issues. People have written, those who have analyzed the present witch hunts have written that for a woman to have some land or to inherit some land, it signifies to really run a high risk of being accused of being a witch, right? And again, another factor that you find, behind the accusation today is that, all these devastating economic policies are affecting people's life. Malnutrition, hunger is rampant. There is no money to cut the grass, so malaria kills many people. Epidemics, many epidemics. It's quite ironic, so much is being said about COVID because it's affecting Europeans and is affecting Americans and rich people in general, but not rich people, but it's affecting, populations that are not usually, in this situation. But epidemics have been very rampant throughout Africa, for instance, or Latin America since the 1980s. People do not have the money to get food. People don't have the money to go to the doctor. In Africa, you have witch doctors who have returned, mostly men. When they don't understand what's the problem, they say witchcraft. When they don't understand what is causing meningitis, Ebola, AIDS, etc., they say witchcraft, right? So the issue is the condition of people's body, health, and so on. Very important. Land, health, all these issues are very much part of the background. There is now instigating, what I call this new war on women, which has been, and not only on women. What we have seen in recent years has been also a new war on children. In countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Angola, Nigeria, children too now are being accused of being demonic, right? And why? Because in many cases, it's very difficult for people to support them. There's no condition for them to have a proper reproduction. Some children have been accused of being witches because at night they were eating the food of the family. At night they were eating the food of the family. So they are being accused of being witches, right? And adding to all this material change in the material economic condition, there's also the monetization, marketization, of large parts of the world, that in the past were still built on communal relations and often in subsistence farming. Is also changing the structure of value. What is valuable and what is not valuable? What is valuable? And so more and more, you find that, particularly among the new generation, right? Valuable is what produces monetary wealth, right? So there is a generational conflict between a new generation of youth, for example, who see that their roles is access to money, and an older generation of people, particularly women, who say, no, wealth is to have trees, to have access to some land, to have some trees. Maybe they don't want to sell the trees. Maybe they don't want to sell the cows. Maybe they don't want to sell the little piece of land that they have. And so this is a conflict in many, many stories of what led a woman to be executed as a witch. You find this conflict. Yeah, you find this conflict. So this is, and very important, central perhaps, is as a catalyst, in this situation, has been the arrival in the 1980s and spreading since then of missionaries, Pentecostal, evangelical sects, right, who have basically preached that it's okay, Jesus wants you to be rich. Jesus wants you to be rich. If you're not rich, this means that there is somebody in your community that is conspiring against you. So they've sold, they are preaching a kind of Christianity, right, that, basically speaks of the devil, looks at misfortune. Oh, there's a misfortune, there is an accident, there is as satanic, the product of a satanic conspiracy, and teaches people that in their community, in their communities, there are people who are collaborating with the devil. In a way, it's a perfect solution, right, to the question of social conflicts. Because you tell people, oh no, the problem is not the IMF. The problem is not the World Bank was coming to take over your land. The problem is not that you have no money, no land, no future, that you have to migrate. You have to die in the Mediterranean over on a boat because there is no future in the countries where you are, even if these countries had a lot of wealth, because the wealth is being taken away by other people, by other companies, right? No, it's Satan, is your neighbor, is the woman, that old woman, is the woman, is the co-wife of etc., etc. This is what is happening. And in fact, there is evidence that whereas the material executor, of the killing, of the tortures, are often young men from the local area, right? Very often, those who are, the real agents, are people in the background, chiefs, local chiefs, authorities, probably working with foreign companies to push people off the land because the land has to be mined, the land has to be used for petroleum drilling. So there's all these relations that are very, very important to understanding why thousands and thousands of women are now still being killed, and why we can speak of a war on women, and why women in particular. Why women in particular? Certainly, two factors are important. One, women are really the cement of the community. You know, you attack the women because of their involvement in reproduction, the children, the food, etc. They are those that, no matter what happens, even in times of war, they have to feed the children. Even in the most difficult time, they have to find the food. They have to make the connections. To kill the women is to destroy the most basic forms of reproduction, is to make a community disintegrate completely. Disintegrate completely. Once the women have done, when there's no reproduction available, there is no future. The community is destroyed. So this is very, very important, right? Most important, right? That the fact of maintaining women in a subordinate position, right, signifies for those who have more power to gain access to a lot of unpaid labor, to sexual services and so on. And it's not an accident that it is the old women who are the main target, yeah, of the persecution, because old women are seen as useless. They cannot produce children. They cannot produce sexual services. They are useless. So central, fundamental, through the history of the witch hunt, from the past to the present, is also a very misogynist conception of women. Is a very misogynist conception of women. And here we could have a lot of discussion as what are the origins, right? But one could say that the more, for example, patriarchal society has depended on women's labor, on the women's body, the procreation, the sex, etc., the more it has depended, the more it has demonized it in order to control it, in order to exploit it, right? So we find that, you know, in the witch hunt of the 16th century, a very important text was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It's considered probably the most misogynist book ever written. The most misogynist book ever written. It tells you why women are more than men inclined to become witches. Why women more than men are making a pact with the devil. Why they're so bad. It tells you that women are creatures that have no reason. They are dominated by their body. They are dominated by their lust, by their instinct. They are like animals. They are halfway between humans and animals. And so they have to be controlled. And so they are more available to be seduced by the devil. So today we find similar views, you know, in the area where witch hunting are taking place, you know. And it's very interesting. There's a woman, Yaga Badoe, who has made a very interesting documentary, The Witches of Gambarga. She went to the northern part of Ghana and interviewed not only the women are there, but also the men who are controlling the place. And the men told, oh, women are, and so the woman asked, well, why you think the women are especially bad, you know? And what it came out is that this fear, because women are so close to reproduction, they cook the food for you. So they are afraid that they are going to poison you, right? They are healing you. And so you're afraid that they have this deep involvement of women's body with the reproductive activities. Is something that has created also this misogyny. On one side, they need to control, they need to exploit. On the other, right, the fear, of course, of the response. So this said, I think is very important. And here I'm going to conclude that we don't look at witch hunting as something of the past. And not only because it's still present, but because witch hunting and the whole history of accusation of women as potential witches, right, has shaped the popular imagination, And it has created a certain conception of women. It has had effects. And moreover, because the kind of war that witch hunting represents is now taking place also in different forms. For example, in the United States now, in many regions, Texas and other parts of the South, we have a whole campaign to forbid abortion. In Texas, they have passed a law that is one of the most outrageous in the world. Anybody, any person can actually get a monetary recompense, right? A monetary reward if that person denounces a woman for having had an abortion or trying to have an abortion. Even a cab driver that drives you to a clinic to have an abortion, right, can denounce you. And he will get $10,000, imagine. And doctors who are performing abortion will be accused of murder. And women will be accused of murder. So, and this, of course, is not the only one. The reason why there's so much violence, so much feminicide still taking place is certainly not unconnected to the factors that are behind witch hunting historically. And that's why it's so important to understand this phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your excellent lecture. If you want, we can move on to the questions now.
Sure.
Okay. The first one is, the accusatory policies of governments are not surprising, but why did they choose these unrealistic accusations like making deals with the devil against women instead of more realistic ones?
Good question. Yeah. Can we have maybe 2 or 3 if there are? I can reply to that one, but I mean, can we
okay.
have, yeah.
The other one is, if there were a substantial amount of men who were accused of witchcraft, can we really say that these accusations was only or fully against women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if witchcraft was seen more among peasants, can we also assume that it was targeting not only women, but also the lower class for some reason?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll start with this one. Actually, there are all kinds of connect. So yeah, why they chose this very fantastic accusation, right? So then I think that the reply is that it should be found in the context in which the first accusation of witchcraft began, right? And the context, the first time you hear about witches, witchcraft, it's in Europe, it's in the 14th century, in the struggle against heresy, the heretics, right? And so the figure, the charge of witchcraft, the idea that there are people who are witches and are making a pact with the devil, right? Really, it's originating in the context of the struggle against the heretics. And basically, the use of very fantastic accusation is to instill a horror, a terror in the population, right? In other words, you can say, oh, this person is a murderer, or this person is a thief. But if you say, this person is allied with the devil, this person is completely evil. And you will not know who they are, right? These people operate in the night. These people operate, might be your neighbor, you don't know, but they work in the night. And they have this supernatural power. It's to create a person, a subject, who is completely instigates an incommensurable fear. Incommensurable fear. How could you have a woman burnt in the presence of her community, in the center of a village, unless she was totally dehumanized? So the accusation, the fantastic accusation, are a way of terrorizing a population, terrorizing to the point that they will be hesitant to defend these women. And they will be more disciplined, more subdued, more easy to defeat, because they will be convinced that among themselves, there are people who have supernatural powers to do evil. So it's a technique of terror, right? Basically terrorizing, the subject. That is why it's taking place. And we say there is women because the majority, in fact, the more and more, witch hunting escalated throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, the more women-centered it became. In the late 15th, you can still have more men. And the men often are people who are connected with the witches. They are people of their family and all, lovers, husbands, sons. They are people who maybe try to rescue them, try to defend them, right? But when you have that kind of terror, that kind of accusation, and those very, very severe punishments, it becomes difficult for people to defend even their own relatives, right? And but really, if you look at the record of the trials and the record of the execution, out of 20 people, you have 5 men and 15 women. So that's the reason it's considered a women-centered phenomenon. Yeah, and no, absolutely. I mean, there's no separate. Yeah, those who are accused are 90% from the lower classes. They are example. They are example of women from also middle class, what we call middle class, in Germany and other places, who eventually are accused. No, but the majority, yeah. So there's no difference there. The witch is an attack. Yeah, it's an attack on lower class people. There is a class dimension, absolutely, to the witch hunts. Absolutely, yeah. I say the classical figure of the witch is the beggar. Is the expropriated proletarian, is the expropriated medieval female proletarian that is the principal subject of this accusation, the principal object of this accusation.
Thank you. I move on to the next questions.
Sure.
In your book, you talk about the change in the meaning of the word gossip, which evoked the solidarity and friendship of women in the first place. Did it evolve the natural flow of society and culture, or was it a deliberate effort?
No, I think the change in the concept of gossip, it's really part of this transformation in social relation and transformation in the way women are looked at and relation among women. So remember, right, the classical accusation, it's actually quite interesting because, here the witch hunt in Europe lasts from, roughly speaking, as I said, 1550 to almost 800. So it's a long time. So there are even changes in the kind of the accusation and so on. There are some changes. And what has been noticed, for instance, is that there is a first period, right, in which in the accusation, the issue of the collectivity, the collective of women is fundamental, right? In other words, the one woman is accused, but she's always seen as part of a women's group. She's always seen as part of a women's collective. So she's accused, and then she asks, who else was with you? With whom did you go? And the witchcraft is seen as being practiced by a sect, by a group of women, right? So there's a very collective notion of this crime. It's a collective crime, right? As the time goes by, it becomes more and more individual. The witch is a person, is not considered necessarily part of a collective as the time goes by. Why? Because in the process of 3 centuries, social relations were changing. And more you have there is a process of individualization. More and more the community was separated, right? So gossip, gossip is a reflection, it's a product, yeah, of this demonization of relation among women, demonization of the women's collective, right? Demonization of the solidarity among women. So that a point comes where being seen with other women, being close to other women, at the lower level, right, becomes dangerous. So there is a transfer, the change, the period of the witch hunt, and the transformation in the concept of gossip goes hand in hand with the attack on the collective of women and the building of the nuclear family. In order to build the nuclear family, you had to transfer the loyalty of women to the other women they work with all day, etc., to one man, right? This is really what is beginning to take place. It's the transfer from the collective of women to the nuclear family, to this one man, and this is your life, and this is your... To the point, as I wrote in Caliban of the Witch, that in some country in England, in the period of the witch hunt, the priests in the churches and the reformers were telling women not to be so close to their own families. Even being close to your own family, to your mother, your father, is now discouraged. But because you have to concentrate your energies towards this husband, towards the child, your husband, right? So this is the creation of the nuclear family is also part of this process, as well as the control of the state over the womb, over the uterus, right? Over the process of procreation, making sure that the uterus belongs to the state and not to women.
Thank you. The beloved ones who were accused of being witch were being sentenced to death for nothing. I mean, did people obey out of religious compliance, or they were just obeying because they had no choice?
I'm not sure I understand. Who are these people in the question?
Do people knew that their beloved ones who were accused of being witch were being sentenced to death for nothing?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, there were many cases of families, sons, husbands who tried to save the women of their family when they were accused, right? And but this was not always possible. So there were cases of people who actually helped women accused to escape, to run away, right? But basically, it was a question of force, the force confronting the force of the state, because once the woman was arrested, it was not necessarily easy to liberate her, even if they knew that she was innocent. Others, for example, may have found it useful, because again, conflicts within family are also then, of course, exploited. Family too have conflicts about property, about land, about sexuality, sexual relations. But it's true that many knew that these charges were false, fabricated. But like today, how do you respond to fabricated? It's not always easy to extricate yourself from the hands of the state.
I'll move on, the next one, thank you. Dear professor, you told that the Catholic Church was one of the reasons for the witch huntings. My question is about the effects of the church reformation on these witch huntings. Were the reformists like Martin Luther, Jean Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli supported the...
Yeah. No, I didn't say. I said that the church, even before Catholic and Protestant, the church of the late feudal period, the church, before it was Catholic or Protestant, it was called Christianity, right? The split takes place in the 16th century. Catholic, Protestant begins in the 16th century. Before you have, right? So the image of witchcraft and the witch, right? It's generated in the process of the struggle of the church and the cities against heresy. Because the church was part of the power. The church was part of the power structure. So church and the power structure were involved in the struggle against heresy. But you see, in the Middle Ages, the churchmen were the intellectuals. They were the ones who were able to write. They used the language of Latin. They were the ones, so they were the ones that were writing the books. They were like the intellectual class. That's why you have the church, right? But I have stressed over and over that by the 16th and 17th centuries, it is really the lay authorities, in other words, non-religious authorities, who are mostly persecuting women as witches. So the witch hunt is not a primarily religious phenomenon, number one. Number two, and I think I said that this before, by the 16th century, when you have already the separation of the church into Catholic and Protestant, you find that despite the separation, despite the struggle between Protestant and Catholic, both accused women of being witches. Witch hunts were going on at the same time, with the same accusation, with the same tactics, both in Catholic and Protestant countries. No difference. So I think it's very important to really show, I look at this as evidence that the witch hunt, again, was not primarily a religious phenomenon, because you see, Catholic, they were separating on everything. There were wars between Catholic countries and Protestant countries, but both persecuted women. I have written in Caliban and the Witch that the witch hunt was one of the first common grounds of the new nation states, Protestant and Catholic alike, was one of the first points of union, right? And it tells us something that, you know, this separation, there was some changes more profound than the factors which separated these Catholic and Protestant, more profound at work, you know, in the witch hunts.
And thank you. Would you consider large-scale name calling campaigns on the internet as witch hunts? You also
can you say it again? If I consider
large-scale name calling campaigns on the internet as witch hunts, you consider about that, and you also emphasize the material foundations of misogyny. In this context, what do you make of some women denounced for their anti-prostitution views in the name of feminism?
Okay, maybe you can have another question again.
The last one is do you think that the pandemic draws attention to the neglect of women's care and reproductive labor? There are more questions, but we have come to end of the time.
Oh, okay. Okay, if you want to give me some of the other questions, I can answer something, huh?
That's all, I guess, now.
Okay, all right. So, I hesitate to call everything witch hunting because, you know, my fear is always that we don't understand the specificity. I very like to use the term for something that I understand that people use witch hunting, you know, in superficial, but let's also be careful not to lose sight of the actual historical processes, because, you know, so that would be my answer. And I don't know, the material basis, women who took a position against prostitutes were accused of being witches. Is that what I understand? Women who took a position against prostitution. The second question is not clear to me. Can you say it again?
Okay. Sorry, I couldn't find it. Do you think that the pandemic draws attention to the neglect of women's care?
Oh yeah, this one, sure. Of course, this is yes. Yeah, of course. And people's care. You know, I think the pandemic showed the collapse of sanitary system. I can speak for a day to tell you that, for example, one simple example, in New York State. New York is considered, you know, one of the richest towns in the world. In New York State, from 2003 to 2019, 41 hospitals were closed down because they were not enough productive, meaning they could not fill all the beds all the time. 19 hospitals in this period were closed just in New York because they were not making enough money. Then comes the pandemic. Oh my God, then there's no space, then the hospitals are full, then, but actually for years, there's been struggle. People struggle, particularly working class people, against the closing of hospitals. We always heard stories of women giving birth in a taxi because they were going to this place and the place and the place, and they couldn't find a place that took them in when they needed to give birth. So absolutely, and this is a big issue, and I hope that people learn in terms of our activism, right, to the fact that we have to change the sanitary system, and we have to take the sanitary system out of the market. The sanitary system, people's health should not be subjected to the market. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Federici.
all the best. All the best.
Thank you for this great lecture. It was enlightening, and for answering our questions.
Thank you. Thank you to you for inviting me. A great pleasure. All the best.
And I also want to thank our audiences. Thanks for coming and listening. Good evening.